little apes needs to move now. You don't belong here. This place is for people who matters.
Black twins denied VIP seats in first class. And moments later their father is the airline owner in a way that proves sometimes the children flight attendants removed from premium cabins have parents who literally own the aircraft they're standing on, have fathers powerful enough to divert planes mid-flight and end careers with single phone calls, have connections that transform routine racial profiling into career-destroying mistakes that follow you forever, because what this flight attendant didn't know when she decided two black 13-year-olds couldn't possibly belong in VIP first class was that their father Raymond Ellis wasn't just a passenger or a concerned parent, he was the owner of the entire airline, was the man who signed her paychecks, was someone who could make her racism cost her everything she'd built over 15 years in aviation. And her confident assertion that these boys needed to know their place was about to teach her exactly what happens when your place is determined by someone whose children you just humiliated. You two need to move right now. You don't belong here. These seats are for premium passengers, not charity cases. I don't know what scam your parents pulled to get you these tickets, but kids like you don't sit in VIP. Especially not kids like you who clearly don't understand that first class has standards, has expectations, has a certain type of passenger, and you are not it. So gather your things and follow me to the back where you belong before I have to call security and make this embarrassing for everyone, Karen Mitchell said to Jordan and Caleb Ellis, who were sitting in seats 1A and 1B of Heritage Airlines Flight 447 from New York to Atlanta, who were 13-year-old twins flying alone for the first time, who'd been so excited about sitting in VIP first class that they'd taken photos of their seats to send to their parents, who'd carefully stowed their bags and buckled their seatbelts and felt very grown-up and responsible, who'd done absolutely nothing except exist while black. In a space where this flight attendant had decided they didn't belong, and her words hit them like accusations they didn't understand, like being told they were wrong for reasons that made no sense, like being singled out for punishment when they'd followed every rule. The accusation charity cases landed in the VIP cabin of Heritage Airlines Flight 447 with the particular sting of racism that doesn't bother hiding behind professional language, that looks at black children in premium seats and assumes fraud rather than legitimate purchase, that sees skin color and decides something must be wrong rather than checking facts. And Jordan felt his hands start shaking as he pulled out his phone to show their boarding passes, as he tried to explain that their father had bought these tickets weeks ago, that everything was legitimate, that they had documentation, but Karen barely glanced at his screen before dismissing it with a wave of her hand that communicated she'd already decided they were lying, that no amount of evidence would change her judgment, that she determined based on appearance alone that these boys were problems requiring removal rather than passengers deserving service. This wasn't ancient history, wasn't something their grandparents had experienced during segregation that they only knew from stories. This was happening right now in 2025 on a commercial aircraft where diversity training and anti-discrimination policies were supposedly standard, where children with legitimate first-class tickets shouldn't be accused of running scams, where a flight attendant telling black passengers they don't belong in premium cabins should be unthinkable. But here was Karen, wielding her authority like a weapon, using her position to enforce unwritten rules about who deserved luxury and who deserved degradation. And if you think airline racism died somewhere between the civil rights movement and today, if you believe we've evolved past flight attendants deciding that black passengers, especially black children, must have stolen or scammed their way into first class, then you need to understand that discrimination didn't disappear when laws changed, it just learned to wear uniforms and hide behind claims about standards and appropriate passengers, while inflicting the same dehumanizing judgments it always has, maybe worse now because it operates while everyone pretends merit matters more than melanin. Jordan had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who were surprised by his grades, store employees who watched him closely, adults who seemed skeptical that he and Caleb were as accomplished as they were, but having a flight attendant publicly accuse them of fraud, publicly declare they didn't belong in seats their father had paid for, publicly humiliate them in front of a cabin full of passengers felt different, felt like racism that was confident enough to be loud, that was comfortable enough to be explicit, that expected support rather than challenge, and he'd been shocked when Karen first approached with that tight smile, had thought maybe there was some legitimate issue with their seats, but as her language became openly discriminatory, as she made clear this was about kids like you rather than any actual problem. Jordan realized with sinking recognition that this was exactly what his father had warned might happen, exactly why his father had hesitated. Before letting them fly alone, exactly the kind of violation that no amount of preparation could prevent. "Ma'am, our father bought these tickets," Caleb said, his voice quiet but trying to stay respectful like their parents had taught them. "We have our boarding passes, we have confirmation emails, everything is legitimate, we're supposed to be in these seats, we're going to Atlanta for our family reunion, our parents are meeting us there, please just check your system and you'll see we're telling the truth." And he held out his phone showing the booking confirmation with their names and seat assignments clearly visible, held it with hands that trembled slightly, held it with hope that maybe evidence would matter, that maybe showing proof would end this. But Karen didn't take his phone, didn't look at the confirmation, didn't check anything, just said with voice that had gone sharp and cold, "I don't care what your phone shows, I don't care what story you've prepared, premium passengers don't send their children alone in first class. Real VIP travelers have standards, and you too are. Going to economy where you belong, now move before I make you move." Other passengers in first class were watching this confrontation with varying degrees of discomfort, were seeing two children being publicly accused and humiliated, were witnessing obvious racial profiling, and some pulled out phones to record but not one person spoke up, not one adult said this is wrong, not one passenger challenged Karen or defended the boys, and their silence felt like participation, felt like agreement, felt like collective decision that watching black children be degraded was acceptable entertainment rather than injustice requiring intervention. If you believe children deserve dignity regardless of their skin color, keep watching because what happens when these twins call their father will restore your faith that sometimes racism targets exactly the wrong family, and if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you paid to be, drop a comment below and tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when removing black children from first class means removing the airline owner's sons. This story doesn't end the way Karen thinks, so hit that like button if you stand against discrimination and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing airline racism that needs to be seen. A young flight attendant named Tanya who'd been preparing the cabin stepped forward and said softly, "Karen, maybe we should verify their tickets. They look legitimate. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding," and Karen spun on her with fury and said, "Mind your business or you'll be next," and Tanya stepped back afraid. And a male passenger cleared his throat like he might speak, but Karen silenced him with a glare and said, "Anyone who interferes will be reported," and Jordan watched potential help evaporate, watched adults choose silence over defending children, watched the possibility of rescue disappear as quickly as it had appeared, but to understand how two polite honor students with legitimate VIP first-class tickets ended up being publicly humiliated and threatened with removal, how a flight attendant's racism escalated unchallenged despite witnesses, how 13-year-old twins found themselves powerless against an adult wielding authority like a weapon, we need to go back 5 hours to a morning in Brooklyn where this day started not with confrontation but with excitement and careful preparation and a father's pride in his son's growing independence. Jordan Matthew Ellis and Caleb Daniel Ellis, 13 years old and 8th graders at Brooklyn Preparatory Academy, were identical twins who shared everything from their birthday to their love of basketball to the particular bond that came from being black boys growing up in a world that would judge them before knowing them, who would make assumptions about their capabilities and their character based on appearance rather than achievement, and they'd learned early to be excellent, to be polite, to carry themselves with dignity that might provide some protection against people who decided their skin color made them suspicious. Jordan was technically older by 4 minutes, was slightly taller, was the more outgoing twin who made friends easily, loved debate team and student government, had dreams of becoming a lawyer like he'd seen on TV, was responsible and caring and protective of his brother even though they were the same age, and Caleb was quieter, more introspective, loved music and art, played saxophone in the school band, had artwork displayed in the main office that visiting parents always admired, was thoughtful and sensitive and carried emotions closer to the surface than Jordan did, and together they were honor roll students, were well liked by teachers and peers, were exactly the kind of young men who should have been trusted to travel independently. Their father Raymond Ellis was the founder and owner of Heritage Airlines, a regional carrier he'd built over 20 years from a single leased aircraft into a fleet of 40 planes serving the eastern United States. But he deliberately kept his ownership quiet from his sons, had told them he worked in aviation, that he had an important job managing operations, but had never revealed the full extent of his position or his power because he wanted them to grow up understanding that worth came from character rather than wealth, that respect should be earned through actions rather than expected because of their last name, that being Raymond Ellis's sons didn't make them better than anyone else and shouldn't shield them from learning how to navigate the world on their own merits. Their mother Angela was a pediatrician who'd taught the boys about empathy and service, about using whatever advantages they had to help others, about recognizing that privilege was responsibility rather than entitlement, and together Raymond and Angela had raised sons who were humble and kind despite growing up with resources most families didn't have. That morning Raymond had driven the twins to JFK Airport himself, had wanted these extra minutes with them before their first solo flight, had talked during the drive about independence and responsibility and how proud he was that they'd reached the age where he trusted them to handle this trip alone, and he'd smiled when he'd told them about their seats, had said, "I booked you in VIP first class because I want you to experience the best. I want you to understand what excellence looks like. I want you to have this memory of flying in comfort," and the twins had been so excited they'd talked over each other thanking him, planning what movies they'd watch, wondering if the seats really reclined all the way flat like Raymond had described, and Raymond had hugged them tight at departures and said, "Call me when you board, text me when you land. Your grandmother is so excited to see you at the reunion, make this weekend special for her." Check-in had gone smoothly, the gate agent processing their tickets without comment. TSA security had been routine with agents who were professional and courteous, and the twins had waited at their gate feeling very grown up, feeling proud that their parents trusted them with this independence, feeling ready for this adventure, and other passengers at the gate were typical mix of business travelers and families, people absorbed in their own journeys, and nobody paid particular attention to two well-dressed teenagers until boarding was called for first class and the twins had walked down the jetway into the aircraft, into the spacious VIP cabin with its leather seats and extra legroom, and they'd found 1A and 1B, the very best seats, window and aisle in the first row, and they'd settled in with excitement, with gratitude, with absolutely no warning that their skin color would make someone decide they didn't belong. Other first-class passengers were mostly white business travelers, men and women in suits carrying laptops, people who flew frequently and expected certain standards of service, and the initial flight attendants who'd greeted them during boarding had been pleasant. A young black woman named Tanya who'd helped them stow their bags and smiled warmly, an older white man who'd offered them newspapers. Professional service that made the twins think this flight would be wonderful, that VIP first class was everything their father had promised, that they were going to have stories to tell their grandmother about luxury travel. Then Karen Mitchell had appeared, had come from the galley where she'd been preparing for departure, and she'd walked down the aisle checking passengers, and when she'd reached row 1 and seen Jordan and Caleb, her expression had shifted immediately from neutral to suspicious, had gone from professional flight attendant to someone who'd decided something was wrong, and she'd stopped at their row and looked down at them with smile that was tight and cold, with smile that didn't reach her eyes, with smile that communicated disapproval rather than welcome, and she'd said with voice that carried false sweetness layered over hostility, "You two need to move, you don't belong here, these seats are not for you, there's been some kind of mistake that we need to correct before takeoff, so please gather your things and come with me," and her tone suggested this was non-negotiable, was instruction rather than request, was order backed by her authority as crew member who controlled access to every part of this aircraft. Jordan felt confusion wash over him because they'd just settled into these seats, had just stowed their bags in the overhead compartment, had just buckled their seatbelts and pulled out their phones to text their parents that they'd boarded, and now this flight attendant was telling them to move, was saying they didn't belong, was claiming there'd been a mistake when their father had carefully booked these tickets weeks ago, and he pulled out his phone to show their boarding passes, to prove they were in the correct seats, and he said politely, "Ma'am, these are our seats. We have our boarding passes right here. You can see we're assigned to 1A and 1B. Our father booked these tickets for us. Everything is correct." And he held out his phone with the digital boarding passes clearly displaying their names and seat assignments, held it with the respect his parents had taught him to show adults, held it with hope that evidence would resolve whatever confusion existed. Karen barely glanced at Jordan's phone, gave it maybe 2 seconds of attention before dismissing it with wave of her hand that communicated she wasn't interested in their documentation, wasn't going to be convinced by boarding passes or confirmation numbers or any proof they tried to offer. And she said there's been a system error. Kids don't sit in VIP first class. Kids don't get these premium seats, especially not. And she paused deliberately, looked both twins up and down with examination so thorough and so judgmental it felt like violation, looked at their skin and their hair and their youth, and she finished her sentence with emphasis that made her meaning unmistakable, especially not kids like you don't belong in VIP, kids like you should know better than to try sitting where you clearly don't fit. The phrase kids like you landed in the first-class cabin with weight of centuries of racism, landed with echoes of every exclusion black people had faced, landed with particular cruelty of being told your very existence in a space was wrong, was inappropriate, was something that needed correcting, and Caleb felt anger mixing with his confusion, felt the injustice of being profiled based on nothing except appearance, felt the unfairness of having legitimate tickets dismissed because of flight. Attendant had decided they looked wrong, and he spoke up saying our dad bought these tickets. They're ours, we're supposed to be here, we didn't make any mistake, you're making a mistake by assuming we don't belong, and his voice carried more edge than Jordan's had carried the frustration of being judged before being known, carried the exhaustion of having to prove worth that should have been assumed. Karen's voice sharpened in response to Caleb's challenge, sharpened with irritation that these children were talking back rather than complying immediately, sharpened with anger that they were questioning her authority rather than accepting her judgment. And she said, I don't know what scam your parents pulled to get you these tickets. I don't know what fraud was involved or what story they told, but these seats are for premium passengers. These seats are for people who actually paid full price. These seats are not for charity cases or upgrade schemes or whatever your family did to access first class. Now I'm telling you one more time to gather your belongings and move before I have to call the captain and make this an official incident. And her accusation of scam, her characterization of them as charity cases, her assumption that their family must have cheated somehow to afford VIP tickets, was racism so explicit it should have been shocking, should have prompted gasps from other passengers, should have resulted in immediate intervention from other crew, but instead the cabin stayed silent, stayed complicit, stayed comfortable with watching black children be accused of fraud without evidence. Jordan felt tears starting because this was so unfair, was so wrong, was violation he didn't know how to fight, and he said we're not charity cases, our father paid for these tickets, we have documentation, please just check your system, please verify before you move us, we didn't do anything wrong, and his voice broke on the last words, broke with emotion he was trying to contain, broke with the particular pain of being good kids who followed rules and still being treated like criminals, and Karen looked at his tears with expression that showed no sympathy, no softening, no recognition that maybe she was wrong, that maybe these children were telling the truth, that maybe her assumptions deserved questioning. Other passengers in first class were watching this confrontation now, were witnessing a flight attendant accuse children of fraud, were seeing obvious racial profiling, and some looked uncomfortable, shifted in their seats, exchanged glances with travel companions that suggested they recognized something was wrong. But not one person spoke up, not one adult said leave these kids alone. Not one passenger challenged Karen or asked to see verification of her claims, and their silence felt like endorsement, felt like agreement, felt like collective decision that watching black children be humiliated was acceptable, was none of their business, was situation they didn't want to involve themselves in even though involvement might have prevented what happened next. And Jordan and Caleb sat there feeling abandoned by every adult in this cabin. Feeling like they were facing Karen's authority completely alone despite being surrounded by witnesses who could have helped but chose not to, and that abandonment hurt almost as much as Karen's accusations, cut almost as deep as being called charity cases, taught them in real time that bystanders who stay silent are complicit in the harm they watch happen. Tanya, who'd been so kind during boarding, who'd smiled warmly and helped them stow their bags, who'd made them feel welcome in first class, stepped forward from where she'd been preparing the galley, and she said softly with voice that tried to be diplomatic, tried to de-escalate, tried to find middle ground between supporting her colleague and protecting these children. Karen, maybe we should verify their tickets in the system. They look legitimate to me. The boarding passes scan correctly. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding, maybe we should check with the gate before we move them, and her intervention was gentle, was phrased as suggestion rather than challenge, was attempt to give Karen graceful exit from mistake she was making, and for a moment Jordan felt hope that maybe Tanya would succeed, that maybe another crew member's voice would carry weight that the twins' voices hadn't carried, that maybe this nightmare was about to end. But Karen spun on Tanya with fury that made the younger flight attendant step back instinctively, spun with face that had gone red with anger, spun with body language that communicated rage at being questioned, and she said in voice that was loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Mind your business, Tanya. This doesn't concern you. I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft and I make the decisions about seating. If you want to keep your job, you'll go back to your duties and let me handle this situation, or you'll be next. Do you understand me? You'll be written up for insubordination and you'll be explaining to management why you thought you could question my authority. Now get back to work before I make this your problem too." And her threat was explicit, was weaponizing her seniority against someone who'd tried to help, was using power to silence dissent, and Tanya's face showed she understood the threat was real, showed she wanted to help but couldn't afford to lose her job. Showed the calculation that so many people make when they decide that protecting vulnerable strangers costs more than they're willing to pay. "I'm sorry," Tanya whispered to the twins, her eyes showing genuine distress, showing she knew this was wrong but felt powerless to stop it, and she stepped back to the galley, stepped away from the confrontation, stepped into the silence that already included every passenger, and Jordan watched her go and felt another layer of hope die, felt another potential rescue evaporate, felt the walls closing in as adults who could have helped chose instead to protect themselves, and he understood with devastating clarity that he and Caleb were completely alone in this, that no one was going to defend them, that they'd have to endure whatever Karen decided to do because challenging her meant risking consequences that grown adults weren't willing to face. A male passenger in row 3, white man probably in his 40s wearing business suit, cleared his throat like he was about to speak, like he was gathering courage to say something, and Jordan looked at him with desperate hope, with prayer that maybe this stranger would be braver than Tanya had been, would use his voice to challenge Karen, would say what needed saying even though it was uncomfortable. But before the man could form words, Karen turned her glare on him and said sharply, "Anyone who interferes will be reported to the captain. Anyone who involves themselves in crew decisions will be noted in my incident report. Anyone who thinks they know how to do my job better than I do can explain themselves to airline management. Now, unless you want to be delayed and questioned, I suggest you mind your own business." And the man's mouth closed, his moment of courage passing, his brief impulse to help crushed by Karen's threat. And he looked away from the twins, looked at his laptop, looked anywhere except at the children who'd silently begged him for help, and his retreat into silence hurt worse than if he'd never considered speaking, hurt because it showed that even people who recognized injustice would abandon you when defending you became inconvenient. Karen grabbed both boys by their arms, grabbed them with force that was unnecessary and deliberately rough, grabbed them with hands that dug into their biceps hard enough to hurt, and she said, "Get up, both of you. Get your bags and follow me now." And Jordan and Caleb had no choice, had no recourse, had no power to resist an adult with authority, and they stood with tears streaming down both their faces now. Stood while Karen pulled their bags from the overhead compartment and thrust them at the boys. Stood while every passenger in first class watched and did nothing, said nothing, chose comfort over courage, chose silence over speaking truth, chose complicity over challenging authority that was being abused right in front of them. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent when children were being discriminated against because speaking up felt risky, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be the person who intervenes next time, because what happens when these twins are marched through the cabin will show you what silence costs. Will show you that recording isn't helping and watching isn't caring. So hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve protection from racist adults. Because Jordan and Caleb needed just one brave passenger and got dozens of cowards with phones instead. Karen marched the twins out of first class, marched them down the aisle with grip that was still too tight on their arms, marched them past every passenger who'd watched this confrontation, past the businessman who'd almost spoken, past Tanya who stood in the galley with tears in her own eyes, past rows of seats where people sat with their phones recording, capturing this violation for social media, for evidence, for content they'd share later while congratulating themselves on bearing witness. Even though witnessing without acting was participation in harm rather than resistance to it, and the twins walked with heads down, with shame burning their faces even though they'd done nothing wrong, with humiliation that would mark them permanently, that would teach them lessons about powerlessness and racism and bystander silence that no 13-year-old should have to learn. And they walked through the divider that separated first class from economy, walked from spacious premium cabin into cramped standard seating, walked from the luxury their father had paid for into the degradation Karen had decided they deserved. The economy cabin was nearly full, was packed with passengers who'd boarded earlier, who'd settled into their seats and stowed their belongings, and they looked up as Karen marched two crying children through the aisle, looked with curiosity mixed with judgment, looked like they were wondering what these boys had done to warrant being forcibly relocated by crew, and their assumptions. Their willingness to believe the twins must have caused problems rather than recognizing they were victims. Added another layer of humiliation, made Jordan and Caleb feel like everyone on this aircraft had decided they were wrong, were bad, were problems that needed handling rather than children who deserved protection. Karen walked them all the way to the back of the plane, all the way past every row of economy seating, all the way to the very last row near the restrooms where the seats were smallest and the noise was loudest and the smell from the lavatories permeated everything, and she stopped at row 38, at two middle seats that were squeezed between other passengers, at the worst possible location on the entire aircraft. "Here," Karen said, shoving the twins toward the seats with force that made Jordan stumble slightly, "this is where you're sitting, middle seats, row 38, right next to the bathrooms where you belong," and she waited while they awkwardly climbed over the passengers already seated by the windows, while they stuffed their bags under seats that had less space than the overhead bins in first class, while they buckled seatbelts in seats that felt tiny after the spacious VIP chairs they'd briefly enjoyed. And once they were seated, Karen leaned down close to their faces, invaded their personal space with her proximity, with her breath on their skin, with her voice that dropped to hiss that only they could hear but that carried venom that made both boys flinch. "This is your place," Karen whispered with voice full of contempt. "This is where you belong, this is where kids like you sit when you fly on my plane, not up front pretending to be something you're not in first class acting like you deserve luxury, but back here in the cheap seats with the regular people, and next time you and your family want to fly, next time you think about booking tickets you can't afford, remember this moment. Remember where you ended up, know your place before you step on my aircraft and try to sit somewhere you don't belong," and her words were designed to wound, were calculated to humiliate, were meant to teach these children that racism had power over them, that adults could violate their dignity without consequence, that being black meant being vulnerable to this kind of degradation no matter what their father had paid for or what rights they thought they had. Jordan's eyes filled with fresh tears hearing Karen's whispered hatred, hearing her claim ownership of the plane, hearing her tell them to know their place like this was 1950s Alabama instead of 2025 commercial aviation, and he couldn't speak, couldn't respond, couldn't do anything except sit there absorbing her venom while tears rolled down his cheeks, while shame and anger and confusion churned in his chest, while he tried to understand how buying tickets and boarding a plane and sitting in assigned seats had resulted in this violation, in this public humiliation, in this explicit racism that no one had stopped. Caleb stared at the floor, stared at his shoes, couldn't look at Karen, couldn't meet the eyes of nearby passengers who'd heard at least some of what she'd said, couldn't do anything except tremble with emotion he didn't know how to process, with rage that had nowhere to go, with hurt that felt physical, with recognition that this was what racism felt like when it had power and you had none. Karen straightened up, smoothed her uniform like she just completed routine task rather than committed act of discrimination that would follow her forever, and she said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "You boys stay in these seats for the duration of the flight. You don't get up, you don't move around, you don't cause any more problems. If you need anything you wait until I'm available. You don't bother other flight attendants, you don't disturb other passengers. You sit here quietly and you think about your behavior. Do you understand me?" And her public instruction made it sound like they'd been punished for misbehavior rather than profiled for their skin color, made nearby passengers assume these children had done something wrong, had earned this relocation through their own actions rather than through Karen's racism. "Yes, ma'am," Jordan whispered because that's what his parents had taught him to say to adults, because compliance was survival, because arguing would only make things worse, and Caleb nodded without speaking, without trusting his voice, and Karen walked away looking satisfied, looking like she'd successfully handled a problem, looking like she'd put these boys in their place and restored order to her aircraft. And she returned to first class, leaving the twins in the back of the plane surrounded by strangers, trapped in middle seats, marked by their tears and their humiliation as passengers who'd been removed from premium cabin, branded by their relocation as people who didn't belong in luxury spaces. The passengers on either side of the twins, a white woman by the window next to Jordan and a white man by the window next to Caleb, both looked uncomfortable, both had witnessed at least part of what happened, both had heard Karen's harsh instructions, and both looked away, looked at their phones, looked out the windows, looked anywhere except at the crying children beside them, and their discomfort without action, their recognition that something was wrong combined with their decision not to address it, felt like abandonment, felt like everyone on this plane had decided that black children's suffering was acceptable, was tolerable, was something you could witness and then ignore because getting involved might make your own flight uncomfortable. Passengers nearby in economy who'd seen the twins being marched to the back, who'd watched them be shoved into these seats, who'd heard Karen's public instructions, whispered to each other, whispered speculation about what the boys had done, whispered assumptions that they must have tried to sneak into first class or had caused some disturbance or had parents who'd scanned the airline, and their whispers carried to where Jordan and Caleb sat, carried judgments based on nothing except seeing black children being punished, carried willingness to believe the worst, and the twins heard the whispers and felt shame intensify, felt like everyone thought they were bad kids, thought they deserved this treatment, thought Karen had been right to move them, and that collective judgment from strangers who knew nothing about them except what they'd witnessed in the last 5 minutes felt crushing, felt like the entire aircraft had decided they were guilty of something even though their only crime was existing while black in a space where someone had decided they didn't belong. For over an hour the twins sat in those middle seats in silence that was heavy with trauma, sat squeezed between passengers who wouldn't make eye contact, sat near restrooms that flushed constantly with sounds that made them flinch every time, sat in discomfort that was physical and emotional and psychological, sat processing what had happened in ways that their 13-year-old minds struggled to comprehend. And Jordan kept replaying Karen's words in his head, kept hearing kids like you and charity cases and know your place, kept trying to understand what they'd done wrong, what they could have said differently, how they could have prevented this, even though rationally he knew they'd done nothing except be black, even though he understood this was racism not their failure, even though his parents had taught him that discrimination wasn't his fault, the shame still lived in his body, still made him feel like maybe he was wrong somehow, maybe he didn't belong in first class, maybe. Karen had seen something in him that proved he wasn't good enough for VIP seating. Caleb sat staring at the seat back in front of him, sat with jaw clenched and hands balled into fists on his lap, sat with anger that was growing rather than fading, with fury at Karen and at the passengers who'd stayed silent and at the system that gave flight attendants power to humiliate children without consequences, and he kept thinking about his father, kept thinking about Raymond who'd proudly booked them VIP seats, who'd wanted them to experience excellence, who'd trusted the airline to treat his sons with dignity, and Caleb felt like they'd failed their father somehow, felt like they'd let him down by getting kicked out of first class, felt guilt that was irrational but persistent, felt like they should have fought harder, should have insisted more forcefully, should have done something to prevent this humiliation even though he knew deep down that nothing they could have said would have changed Karen's mind, that racism doesn't respond to logic or documentation or children's. Please. The flight attendant call button was right above their heads, was within easy reach, and Jordan thought about pressing it, thought about asking for water or asking to speak to a supervisor or asking for help, but fear stopped him, fear of making things worse, fear of calling attention to themselves again, fear that Karen would come back and punish them for bothering crew, and so he sat there thirsty and miserable but unwilling to press the button, unwilling to risk another confrontation, unwilling to give Karen another opportunity to tell them they were problems, and his fear of seeking help, his learned helplessness after 1 hour of being treated like he had no rights, showed how quickly discrimination taught children to make themselves small, to expect nothing, to accept mistreatment as normal. Other passengers continued their flights normally, continued reading books and watching movies on seatback screens and sleeping with neck pillows, continued living their comfortable lives while two children sat traumatized 3 rows behind them, and their ability to move on, to forget what they'd witnessed, to return to normalcy while the twins suffered, showed the privilege of not being targeted, showed how easy it was to witness harm and then dismiss it, showed how racism operated partly. Because people who weren't victims could simply look away, could decide it wasn't their problem, could choose comfort over solidarity without consequences. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers started moving around the cabin, and Jordan watched people walk past to use the restroom, watched them glance at him and Caleb with curiosity or pity or indifference, watched them see 2 black boys with tear-stained faces and make their own assumptions, and some passengers looked sympathetic, looked like they felt bad for whatever had happened. But sympathy without action meant nothing, meant they'd decided. Feeling sorry was sufficient, meant they weren't going to ask if the boys were okay or challenge what had happened or do anything that might require effort or courage or risk. Around the 1-hour mark, Jordan's phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out and saw text from his mother asking how the flight was going, asking if they'd enjoyed first class, asking them to send pictures from their VIP seats, and he stared at the text, feeling his throat close up, feeling fresh tears threaten, feeling the weight of having to tell his parents what happened, having to admit they weren't in first class anymore, having to explain that they'd been kicked out and humiliated and told they didn't belong, and he showed the text to Caleb, who looked at it and then looked at Jordan with eyes that were red from crying, with face that showed he was thinking the same thing Jordan was thinking, that they needed to tell their parents, that they needed help, that this was too big for them to handle alone. "We should call Dad," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and the bathroom sounds. "We should tell him what happened. He needs to know." And Jordan felt resistance because calling their father felt like admitting defeat, felt like proving they weren't mature enough to handle independent travel, felt like disappointing the man who'd trusted them with this responsibility, but he also felt desperate for rescue, desperate for someone with power to make this right, desperate for his father's protection, even though asking for it felt like failure. "What if he's disappointed in us?" Jordan whispered back. "What if he thinks we did something wrong? What if he doesn't believe us?" And his fears were the fears of a child who'd been violated by authority, who'd learned in the last hour that adults could hurt you and get away with it, who'd been taught that his word didn't matter against a flight attendant's word. And Caleb said, "Dad will believe us. Dad always believes us. We didn't do anything wrong and he'll know that. We have to tell him. We can't just sit here for the whole flight like this." Jordan looked around the economy cabin, looked at the cramped seats and the passengers who'd decided the twins weren't worth defending, looked at the bathroom doors that kept opening and closing, looked at everything his father had paid to protect them from, and he felt anger finally breaking through his shame, felt fury that Karen had stolen what should have been wonderful experience, that racism had transformed their first solo flight from adventure into trauma, that they'd been powerless to prevent violation that never should have happened. And he pulled out his phone and opened it to his father's contact, and he stared at the name Raymond Ellis for a long moment, gathering courage, preparing himself to admit what happened, steeling himself for the conversation that would change everything, and then he pressed call and lifted the phone to his ear with hand that trembled, with heart that pounded, with hope and fear mixing in equal measures. The phone rang once, just once, and then Raymond's voice came through warm and concerned, saying, "Boys, everything okay? You should be in the air by now. How's first class treating you? Are the seats as comfortable as I promised?" And hearing his father's voice, hearing the pride and excitement in Raymond's tone, hearing him ask about first class that they'd been kicked out of, made Jordan's composure shatter completely, made the tears he'd been trying to contain flood out, made his voice break as he tried to speak, and he said "Dad" through sobs that made words almost unintelligible. "Dad, something bad happened. We're not in first class anymore. The flight attendant moved us. She said we don't belong there. She said we're charity cases. She grabbed us and marched us to the back," and his words tumbled out in rush of pain and confusion. In attempt to explain violation, he barely understood himself. "What?" Raymond said, his voice shifting instantly from casual warmth to sharp focus. "What do you mean she moved you? Slow down, Jordan. Tell me exactly what happened, who moved you and why." And Jordan took shaking breath and started from the beginning, started with Karen approaching their seats, with her saying they needed to move, with showing her their boarding passes that she dismissed, with her calling them charity cases and saying kids like you don't belong in VIP, with Tanya trying to help, and Karen threatening her, with the passenger who almost spoke up but didn't, with being grabbed by their arms and marched through the cabin while everyone watched, with being shoved into middle seats in the very back near the bathrooms, with Karen leaning close and telling them to know their place, and as Jordan recounted each detail his voice kept breaking, kept catching on sobs, kept revealing the depth of trauma this hour had created. Caleb leaned close to Jordan's phone adding details his brother missed, adding that Karen had accused their father of running a scam, that she'd said premium passengers not charity cases, that she'd called it her plane, that passengers had recorded everything but no one had helped, that they'd been sitting in economy for over an hour feeling ashamed and powerless, and his voice shook with anger rather than tears, shook with fury that needed outlet, shook with need for his father to fix this, to make it right, to use whatever power he had to ensure Karen faced consequences for what she'd done. Raymond listened without interrupting, listened to his sons describe discrimination he'd hoped to protect them from, listened to them recount violation that made his hands clench into fists, listened with silence that was controlled rage, was fury so intense it required effort to contain, was recognition that someone had harmed his children and would pay for it. "Boys," Raymond said when they'd finished, and his voice was calm but underneath the calm was steel, was ice, was controlled fury that promised consequences. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You did nothing wrong, you hear me? Nothing. That flight attendant committed serious violations, she discriminated against you based on race, she physically handled minors inappropriately, she denied you services you'd paid for, and she's going to face consequences that will end her career. Now I need you to stay exactly where you are, don't move from those seats, don't engage with her again, don't do anything except sit quietly. Daddy's handling this right now, within minutes everything is going to change, I promise you this nightmare is ending. Do you trust me?" "Yes, Dad," both twins said together, said with voices that showed relief flooding through them, said with recognition that their father believed them, that he wasn't disappointed, that he was going to protect them, that they hadn't failed him by being victimized, and Raymond said, "I love you both so much, you're brave and strong and you handled this with more dignity than most adults would have shown. I'm proud of you even though I'm furious about what happened to you. Now stay on the line with me." For just a moment, I'm making some calls and they heard him put them on speaker, heard him dial another number, heard him say, "This is Raymond Ellis. I need you to connect me to the cockpit of Flight 447 immediately, this is priority 1, and his tone carried authority that made whoever answered jump to comply. The twins sat holding Jordan's phone between them, sat listening to their father make calls that would change everything, sat feeling the power differential shift for the first time since Karen had approached their seats, sat recognizing that their father wasn't just any concerned parent, was someone whose name made people respond immediately, whose authority extended into systems they hadn't understood. And Caleb whispered to Jordan, "Did you know Dad had this kind of power? Did you know he could call the cockpit?" And Jordan shook his head no, whispered back, "I knew he had an important job, but I didn't know it was like this. I didn't know people jumped when he called." And they listened as Raymond said, "This is Raymond Ellis, owner of Heritage Airlines. I need to speak to Captain Morrison immediately, patch me through now." Owner of Heritage Airlines, the words hung in the air between the twins, hung in their understanding of who their father was, hung in recognition that they'd been flying on their father's airline, that Karen had profiled and humiliated and violated the owner's children, that her confident assertion about knowing her place was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, and Jordan and Caleb looked at each other with eyes wide, with shock mixing with their relief, with understanding dawning. That their father hadn't just worked in aviation, hadn't just managed operations, hadn't just had an important job, he owned the entire airline, owned the planes and employed the crews and had ultimate authority over every aspect of Heritage Airlines, including the power to end Karen's career with a single decision. And they listened as their father's voice came through the phone, speaking to someone else now, speaking with tone that was professional but carried undercurrent of barely controlled rage. "Captain Morrison," Raymond said, "this is Raymond Ellis. I'm calling about a serious incident occurring on your aircraft right now. One of your flight attendants, Karen Mitchell, has just committed egregious racial discrimination against 2 minor passengers. She forcibly removed my sons from their legitimate first-class seats, physically grabbed them, publicly humiliated them, and relocated them to economy based solely on their race. And I need you to understand that this is not a complaint I'm filing for later review. This is an emergency situation requiring immediate intervention. I need you to divert this aircraft to the nearest suitable airport. I need security to board and remove Karen Mitchell from duty, and I need this handled within the next 15 minutes. Do you understand the severity of what I'm telling you? The twins couldn't hear Captain Morrison's response, but they could imagine his shock, could picture the pilot's face going pale as he understood that the owner of the airline was on the phone describing discrimination by his crew, that his flight attendant had targeted the boss's children, that his aircraft was about to be diverted because of personnel matter that was going to have massive consequences. And they heard Raymond continue saying, "I'm sending you documentation right now, boarding. Passes showing my sons were assigned to seats 1A and 1B, confirmation of their VIP first-class tickets purchased 3 weeks ago, and I'm telling you that Karen Mitchell grabbed my 13-year-old sons by their arms, marched them through your cabin while passengers recorded, and told them they don't belong in first class because kids like them are charity cases." Those were her exact words, Captain. Charity cases? Kids like you? Know your place. All of this witnessed by dozens of passengers. All of this captured on multiple phones. All of this constituting clear racial profiling and discrimination. Within minutes, within less time than the twins would have thought possible, they felt the aircraft bank slightly, felt the change in engine sound that suggested descent, felt the shift in altitude that meant Captain Morrison was following Raymond's instructions, was diverting the flight, was treating this as the emergency their father had declared it to be. And the captain's voice came over the intercom saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making an emergency diversion to Philadelphia International Airport due to an internal personnel matter. We will be landing in approximately 12 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We apologize for this inconvenience and will provide updates as the situation develops." And his announcement was met with confusion throughout the cabin, with passengers looking at each other wondering what personnel matter warranted diversion, what emergency required landing before reaching their destination. Karen, who'd been in the first-class galley preparing service, heard the announcement and came out looking confused, came walking through the cabin toward the cockpit with expression that suggested she had no idea this diversion was about her, that she thought some other crew member had caused a problem, that she was going to help handle whatever emergency had occurred, and she walked past where the twins sat without even glancing at them, walked with confidence that was about to be shattered, walked toward a reckoning she didn't see coming, and Jordan and Caleb watched her pass and felt satisfaction beginning to replace their trauma, felt anticipation of justice that was minutes away, felt their father's power operating on their behalf in ways that made them feel protected for the first time since Karen had approached their original seats. The plane descended rapidly, descended with urgency that suggested Captain Morrison understood the seriousness of Raymond's instructions, descended through clouds toward Philadelphia where airport security was already being briefed, where arrangements were being made to board the aircraft immediately upon landing, where Heritage Airlines ground staff were preparing to handle a situation that would become company legend, would be studied in training programs, would reshape policies around discrimination complaints, and the twins sat holding hands now, sat with their father still on the phone saying, "I'm proud of you boys. You're about to see what happens when someone harms my children. You're about to learn that racism has consequences when it targets the wrong family, and I wish you didn't have to learn this lesson. Wish you could have had the wonderful first-class experience I planned, but since that was stolen from you, I'm going to make sure everyone involved understands that discriminating against black children on my airline ends careers." The wheels touched down in Philadelphia, touched down with bump that made passengers gasp slightly, touched down with speed that suggested emergency landing protocols, and the plane taxied quickly toward a gate where flashing lights were already visible through the windows, where security vehicles were positioned, where personnel were waiting to board, and Karen, who'd been strapped into a jump seat for landing, looked increasingly nervous, looked like she was starting to suspect this diversion might be related to her, looked like confidence was beginning to crack as she calculated whether her treatment of the twins could have somehow reached management, could have triggered this response, could have put her job at risk, and her nervousness showed she understood on some level that she'd made mistake, that her casual racism had crossed a line, that consequences she'd been certain would never come were possibly arriving. The plane stopped at the gate, the seatbelt sign dinged off. But before any passengers could stand, the cockpit door opened and Captain Morrison emerged with face that was grim, emerged with 2 airport security officers who'd boarded immediately, emerged with body language that communicated this was serious, and he walked directly to where Karen stood in the aisle, walked past first-class passengers who turned to watch, walked with purpose that made the entire cabin go silent, and he said, "Karen Mitchell, you're being removed from duty effective immediately. Please cooperate with these officers and exit the aircraft." And Karen's face showed shock, showed denial, showed her saying, "What? Why? What did I do? I don't understand." And Captain Morrison said, "You discriminated against passengers, you violated company policy, you physically handled minors inappropriately. Now please exit the aircraft without causing further disruption." And his words were delivered loudly enough that every passenger nearby could hear, loudly enough that the people who'd watched Karen humiliate the twins now understood exactly why the flight had been diverted. "I didn't discriminate," Karen said, her voice rising with panic, her face flushing red with combination of embarrassment and anger. "I was enforcing seating policies. Those kids didn't belong in first class. Their tickets were fraudulent. I was doing my job," and her defense, her insistence that she'd been right to move the twins, her characterization of legitimate tickets as fraudulent, showed she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong, still believed her racism was justified procedure, still thought she could talk her way out of consequences. And one of the security officers said, "Ma'am, we need you to come with us now. We can discuss this in the terminal," and he reached for her arm with gesture that mirrored how she'd grabbed the twins, with hand that made her experience fraction of the physical control she'd exerted over children. The security officers escorted Karen down the aisle toward the exit, escorted her past every passenger who'd watched her abuse the twins, past the businessman who'd almost spoken up, past Tanya who stood in the galley with tears streaming down her face, past rows of people who'd recorded Karen's discrimination and were now recording her removal, capturing her walk of shame the same way they'd captured the twins' humiliation. And Karen's face showed she understood this was real. This wasn't going to be reversed. This was happening in front of everyone, and her humiliation, while not equivalent to what she'd inflicted on Jordan and Caleb, was at least visible, was at least witnessed by the same audience who'd seen her cruelty. And as she passed the twins still sitting in row 38, she looked at them and her expression showed recognition, showed her understanding that these were the children who'd somehow triggered this response. These were the kids whose father had power she hadn't anticipated, and her look carried shock but not remorse, carried surprise but not apology, carried recognition of consequences but not acceptance of responsibility. The moment Karen was off the aircraft, a senior flight attendant, a black woman probably in her 50s with kind eyes and professional bearing, walked quickly to the back of the plane to where Jordan and Caleb sat, walked with purpose and compassion, walked like she'd been briefed on what happened and was horrified, and she knelt in the aisle beside their seats so she was at eye level with them, and she said softly with voice full of genuine sorrow, "Jordan and Caleb Ellis, I'm Patricia and I'm the senior crew supervisor. I need you to know first that we are profoundly sorry for what Karen Mitchell did to you. What she did was wrong, was discriminatory, was violation of everything this airline stands for. And second, I need you to know that your father is Raymond Ellis, who owns Heritage Airlines. He's our boss. He's the founder of this company. And what Karen did wasn't just morally wrong, it was specifically harmful to the owner's children, though that shouldn't matter because discrimination is wrong regardless of who the victim is." The twins stared at Patricia, processing the confirmation of what they'd begun to understand from their father's phone calls, processing that their dad owned this airline, that he wasn't just important manager but the founder and owner, that he'd kept this from them deliberately, that his power was absolute in ways they hadn't imagined. And Jordan said, "Our dad owns the airline. Why didn't he tell us?" And Patricia smiled gently and said, "Because he wanted you to grow up humble, wanted you to earn respect through your character, not expect deference because of his position, wanted you to understand your worth comes from who you are, not who he is. But when you needed him to use that position to protect you, he did it without hesitation. And now we're going to make this right. We're escorting you back to first class, not to your original seats but to the best seats on this aircraft. Seats 1A and 1B are good, but we're upgrading you to our premium VIP suite seats that are usually reserved for our most elite customers, and every member of this crew is going to personally apologize to you." Patricia helped the twins gather their belongings, helped them climb over the passengers who'd sat silently while they suffered, helped them walk back through economy where people watched with expressions mixing guilt and curiosity, helped them move through the divider into first class where passengers who'd witnessed their original humiliation now watched their return, and the atmosphere in first class was different now. was charged with awareness of what had happened, with recognition that staying silent had been moral failure, with understanding that these children they'd watched being abused were the owner's sons, and several passengers looked ashamed, looked like they wished they'd spoken up when it mattered, looked like they were calculating whether late apologies would mean anything. Tanya approached the twins as they entered first class, approached with face wet with tears, approached with body language showing distress, and she said, I'm so sorry I didn't defend you harder. I tried, but when Karen threatened my job I backed down and I've been sick about it ever since. I should have been braver, should have protected you even if it cost me everything. And Jordan said it's okay you tried. You were the only one who tried. And Tanya shook her head and said it's not okay. Trying isn't enough when children are being harmed. I failed you and I have to live with that. And her genuine remorse, her recognition that fear didn't excuse complicity, made her different from the passengers who'd said nothing, made her someone who understood that witnessing discrimination without effectively challenging it was its own form of participation. Patricia led the twins to seats at the very front of first class, seats that were larger and more luxurious than the ones they'd originally had, seats with extra privacy and extra space, seats that represented the airline's attempt to provide some compensation for trauma that couldn't be undone with upgrades. And as Jordan and Caleb settled into these seats, every flight attendant on the crew came individually to apologize. Came to say we're sorry this happened. Came to promise this didn't represent the airline's values. Came to acknowledge that their silence or absence during the incident was failure, and the twins accepted the apologies with grace their parents had taught them, but also with exhaustion because apologies didn't erase what had happened, didn't remove the memory of Karen's hands grabbing their arms, didn't eliminate the shame of being marched through the cabin, didn't undo the hour of sitting in economy feeling like they deserved degradation. The flight took off again from Philadelphia, took off 90 minutes late, took off without Karen, who'd been officially suspended and escorted to airport security offices where she was being questioned, where her employment file was being pulled, where the process of termination was already beginning, and Captain Morrison made announcement saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We experienced a serious personnel matter that required immediate intervention. We're now continuing to Atlanta. We appreciate your patience," and the vague explanation left passengers speculating, left them piecing together what they'd witnessed, left them understanding that the black twins they'd watched being removed from first class had somehow triggered flight diversion and crew members' removal, and their speculation was confirmation that discrimination had consequences, at least when the victims had power. At least when the children being violated happened to be the owner's sons. But what about all the other black passengers Karen had profiled over 15 years? What about the victims without connections? What about the people whose complaints had gone nowhere because they didn't have fathers who could divert planes? The flight landed in Atlanta 2 hours behind schedule, landed where Raymond and Angela Ellis were waiting at the gate, were standing with lawyers and Heritage Airlines executives, were positioned to meet their sons the moment they deplaned. And when Jordan and Caleb walked off the aircraft and saw their parents, they ran like the children they were, ran into arms that had always protected them, ran towards safety they'd been denied for hours, and Raymond caught them both and held them so tight they could barely breathe, held them while they cried into his shoulders, held them while Angela wrapped her arms around all three of them, held them like he could squeeze out the trauma, could physically remove the violation, could undo what had been done by sheer force of love. And he whispered, I'm so sorry I wasn't there, I'm so sorry this happened to you, and his voice broke on the words, broke with guilt that his power hadn't prevented this, that his ownership of the airline hadn't protected his sons from employee who decided their skin color mattered more than their tickets. Angela pulled back to look at her sons, to examine their faces that were puffy from crying, to check their arms where Karen had grabbed them and where faint marks were still visible. And she said with voice that mixed fury and tenderness, my brave boys, my strong, beautiful boys, you did nothing wrong, you handled this with more grace than most adults would have shown. I'm so proud of you and so heartbroken that you experienced this. And Jordan said, Mom, we tried to show her our tickets, we tried to explain, we were polite like you taught us, but she didn't care, she just decided we didn't belong. And Angela said, I know, baby, I know, racism doesn't care about your politeness or your documentation or your excellence. It just sees your skin and decides you're less than, and that's not your failure, it's hers, it's the world's failure, it's the sickness we're still fighting. Raymond said to his sons, "I never wanted you to learn this lesson so young, never wanted you to experience the kind of discrimination I've faced. I kept my position secret because I wanted you to grow up humble, to understand your worth comes from who you are, not what I own. But now you know, now you've learned that being excellent doesn't protect you, that having a father with power doesn't prevent racism, that you can do everything right and still be violated, and the only silver lining is that you also learn that sometimes, there are consequences, that your father will move heaven and earth for you, that discrimination against my sons will cost people everything, but I wish the lesson had been different, wish you just had a wonderful flight instead of this trauma." But the resolution wasn't clean, wasn't happy ending where justice erased pain, because despite Karen's termination and the apologies and the upgraded seats, Jordan and Caleb carried damage that wouldn't heal quickly, carried psychological wounds that manifested in ways that broke their parents' hearts, and in the weeks following the incident both twins developed severe anxiety about flying, would have panic attacks when entering airports, would relive Karen's hands grabbing their arms whenever they saw flight attendants, would hear her voice saying "know your place" in quiet moments, and they required therapy, required professional help to process trauma that 13-year-olds shouldn't carry, required support to rebuild sense of safety that had been shattered, and their need for therapy, their ongoing struggles with anxiety and hypervigilance and fear of authority, showed that consequences for perpetrators didn't undo harm to victims, that Karen losing her job didn't give the twins back their innocence. Within 72 hours of the incident, Karen Mitchell was officially terminated from Heritage Airlines, was fired with documentation that detailed her discrimination, her physical handling of minors, her violation of company policies, her creation of hostile environment, and Heritage Airlines reported her conduct to the Federal Aviation Administration and to industry databases that tracked employee misconduct, effectively blacklisting her from ever working in commercial aviation again, ensuring that her racism had cost her not just one job but her entire career, had eliminated 15 years of seniority and benefits and professional identity, had reduced her from senior flight attendant to unemployable pariah whose name was now permanently associated with discriminating against children. Karen's story spread rapidly through aviation industry networks and then into mainstream media, spread through news articles about twins removed from first class who turned out to be airline owners' sons, spread through social media where passengers who'd recorded the incident posted their videos, spread through communities that shared stories of discrimination as warnings and as evidence that racism persisted. And Karen's face became recognizable, became attached to narrative of flight. Attendant who told black children they didn't belong in first class, who grabbed minors and forced them to know their place, who lost everything when she targeted the wrong family, and her notoriety made her toxic, made her unemployable not just in aviation but in any customer-facing role where her face might be recognized, where her past might surface, where employers might decide the liability wasn't worth the risk. If this story made you realize that recording discrimination without intervening makes you part of the problem, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be the passenger who speaks up next time, who challenges racist crew members, who protects vulnerable children even when it's uncomfortable, because Jordan and Caleb needed just one brave adult and got dozens of cowards with cameras. So hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve protection regardless of who their father is. Months passed and Karen's isolation became complete, became suffocating as former friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with her infamy, as family members stopped calling because her name brought shame, as her savings depleted while job applications were rejected, and she spiraled into depression that required hospitalization, required treatment for mental health crisis that came from losing everything, from being defined by worst things she'd done, from understanding too late that casual racism had catastrophic consequences. But her suffering while real didn't generate the sympathy that the twins' suffering generated because she'd chosen her actions while they'd been innocent victims, because she'd had power to prevent this while they'd had none, because consequences she faced were results of choices she made while trauma they carried was inflicted without their consent. 3 years after the incident, Karen was hospitalized again for complications from depression and years of isolation, was admitted to a hospital where she lay in a bed feeling the weight of loneliness, and a young black nurse came to check her vitals, came with professional competence and gentle manner, and Karen looked at her face and felt something familiar, felt like maybe she'd seen this woman before. And the nurse smiled softly and said, I know who you are. I know what you did to those boys. I was working at Heritage Airlines that day. I was Tanya. I was the flight attendant who tried to stop you. And Karen felt shame flood through her, felt recognition that this woman she'd threatened, this woman whose job she'd endangered for trying to defend children, was now caring for her with dignity Karen didn't deserve, and Tanya continued, I treat you with respect not because you earned it but because that's who I am. That's the difference between us. You decided those boys didn't deserve dignity based on their skin color. I'm deciding you deserve medical care based on your humanity. And Karen turned to the wall and wept for everything she'd lost, wept for the person she'd been, wept for choices she couldn't undo, wept alone because there was no one left who cared enough to comfort her tears.